Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this event hosted by the Center for Geopolitics. Thank you for coming out on this cold Friday evening. My name is Donatas Kupčiūnas. I'm a Baltic Fellow at the Center for Geopolitics, and it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Jonathan Haslam, who is going to talk his latest book tonight, Hubris, The Origins of Russia's War Against Ukraine. Now, Jonathan Haslam needs no introduction, at least among Sovietologists in the world. He's a professor emeritus in the history of international relations at Cambridge University. He's a leading scholar on the history of the Soviet Union and the history of thought in international relations. He has authored a whole range of important books. First of all, his works on the foreign policy of the Soviet Union in both interwar and Cold War periods. His books on the Soviet Union also include International Communism and the Origins of the Second World War, as well as a new history of Soviet intelligence. In addition to his work on the Soviet Union, Professor Haslam also wrote a biography of E.H. Carr, as well as work on realist thought in international relations since Machiavelli, which is a sort of comprehensive history of realist thought in the last 500 years. Okay, so hubris. What were the roots of the Russo-Ukrainian War? What the United States had to do with it, and where is this all going? Professor Haslam, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Firstly, just to say that the book published in England is called Hubris, The Origins of the Russia's War Against Ukraine, but the Harvard edition is called Hubris, The American Origins of Russia's War Against Ukraine. And that's, come along. This isn't just an example of Americocentrism in the age of Trump. It goes to the core of what I found. Well, firstly, I should say I had no intention of working on this subject at all because I'm a trained historian. I always need archives. I need to hide away. Books aren't enough for me. I need to see the real documents for them to talk to me. I'm that weird. So I thought the publisher asked me to do a book on what went wrong. So he wanted me to do something on why everything went wrong, and I immediately thought it must be the Russians, and started work on this. So the first thing I did, I went to see Andrei Kelin, the Russian ambassador in London. This was September, after the war had broken out. And he graciously gave me 2.5 hours of his time over an amazing meal. And we agreed we weren't going to talk about the war, because otherwise the conversation would have taken about 2 minutes, and I would have left. We talked about why the war. And I said, well, I can do this off the record if you like. No, don't do it off the record. And then he proceeded, and I said, okay, let's do it by stages. I want you to tell me what went wrong at what point, what were the turning points in Putin's mind. And that's how it began. And I said to him, which I learnt to do when doing biography or very recent history, and you've interviewed somebody, always don't leave without a list of names and hopefully also recommendations. So he gave me a list of names of people to talk to, all of whom agreed to talk to me except for the then Secretary General of NATO, Robertson. But everybody else agreed. And then as I saw each person, so I went, thanks to Charles Clarke. Unfortunately, Charles, for family reasons, can't be here today. Charles was Home Secretary under Tony Blair. I got to see Tony. I got to talk to Jonathan Powell, who was the National Security Advisor, and he's now again National Security Advisor, poor guy, under Keir Starmer, which is a bit different from Tony Blair. And so there were a range of people, and then the final people I saw, when I'd more or less written everything, with one exception, our former ambassador to Moscow, whom I saw intermittently throughout as I was sort of picking up details, with a whole trail of former diplomats. and former head of former C at MI6, and various other people. But the core breakthrough for the research was really finding the private papers, or state papers of Strobe Talbot, who was in on the beginning of all this. And once I got into Strobe's paper, I'd known him a bit in Washington under Reagan in the 80s when I was there. Strobe Talbot ended up becoming Deputy Secretary of State. But initially, the story begins when Strobe, who shared rooms with Bill Clinton, which must have been terribly exciting, at Oxford as I can't imagine Strobe in the same room, but anyway, they shared rooms in Oxford. And when Clinton became president, he invited Strobe to join the administration. Strobe was then had done a lot of work. I got to know him a bit in the 80s under Reagan. He got to know Paul Nitzer and looking at missiles and all the rest of it. And so he was a well-established scholar on Russia, and had sort of translated, in a manner of speaking, Khrushchev's memoirs, which I remember Leonard Shapiro, which were called Khrushchev Remembers. And I remember Leonard Shapiro, who hated the Soviet Union with violence, said, yes, we'll call it Khrushchev Forgets. And that was, it was a rather forgettable set of memoirs as translated. Anyway, the point was that Clinton invited Strobe to join the administration as the point man on Russia. More or less everything will go through you. And this mattered because the Cold War had come to a sticky end for the Russians. Russia had basically imploded. But then the Americans did the worst possible thing. George Bush, 41, the 41st president, announced, victory. And then Brzezinski and a whole slew of other people started saying, yeah, we won the Cold War, we won the Cold War. In fact, the Russians lost, but they didn't lose to the Americans. They lost to themselves. The place imploded. We can go into that. The question was what to do next. And George Bush Sr., had it not been for Saddam Hussein, would have had a nice, quiet interlude before perhaps another term, but it wasn't to be, and Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and we had the first Iraq War. Now, his Secretary of State and others in the administration were looking forward, and they thought, oh my God, particularly his National Security Advisor, General Scowcroft, who was a terribly tall man, Air Force. He didn't have much conversation. I had dinner with him at a seminar for about 4 months, and with Nitzer and all these other people. It was former Secretary of Defense Brown's seminar at SAIS. And I think if he said more than 2 things at any seminar, it was miraculous. But he was certainly a man of secrets. And after the Soviet Union collapsed, which the Bush administration didn't want because it would disturb the universe, they tried everything to sort of keep it glued together. This was a general reaction. Keep the old enemy, unfit, semi-crippled, but standing. That was difficult even with recent general secretaries of the Soviet Communist Party who had to be sort of hauled into a room. But anyway, what they feared most, what Scowcroft and the Secretary of State and others feared most, was that because the Soviet Union had collapsed, no one would want NATO anymore. Worse still, no one would want the United States hanging around Europe anymore and would be at the airport at Orly or wherever and wave them off. Thank God the Americans have gone. Now we can do what we want to do. And of course, what the French wanted to do was to contain Germany, this expanded Germany that reunited by all means possible, which of course the British weren't very keen on, and lock them into a unified currency. And now we're here. So the French sort of succeeded. But the Americans didn't want to go. And there was a lunch in the White House that the National Security Advisor gave to François Mitterrand, who was then the president of France, much better than the current one. And Mitterrand didn't like the idea that the Americans were trying to find a way out. And George Bush, 41, his suggestion was, why don't we expand NATO and take in the whole globe? And he did this at a meeting of the NATO leaders without forewarning. And Mitterrand threw a fit and said, we can't discuss this. It's not on the record, you know, forget it, go away. And they had a row. George Bush tried to make up to him later. Mitterrand wouldn't hear of it. So Scowcroft had reason to invite Mitterrand to lunch to try and sort of gear something up, and it completely failed. Now, had the Germans decided an alternative to NATO, this would have been a solution. But Chancellor Kohl was in a fix because he was taking in the whole of the East. All of these Aussies had to be sort of re-Germanized and will be on social security for God knows how long, because all these German industries would collapse because they were all centrally controlled by the state. They couldn't compete anywhere. And therefore, Kohl faced a dilemma of how to solve these problems. So, you know, he was a man, as an Aaron Bevan believed, you know, socialism as a language of priorities. And Kohl certainly believed politics was a language of priorities, and his priority was domestic. So when Mitterrand and others said to him, well, what about Europe, you know, as a whole, and said, okay, I give in, you can have your single currency and you can contain us within Europe. So that was the concession. There was still a severe problem. Well, Germany's alternative government, if you like, were not the Social Democrats, whom we didn't hear from for a long while, but the Liberal Democrats, Free Democrats. And so they said to Kohl, you know, with a bit of imagination, we can create a new European security architecture. And when Kohl's national security advisor came to him and said, yes, you know, that's certainly what we ought to do, Kohl said, no, don't bother me now. I've got too much to deal with. Don't bother me. The same happened when the Pope's nuncio in Berlin, or it was still Bonn, came along and said, you know, by the way, you know we've got a lot of Croatians in Germany. You've got a lot of Croatians living here, and they're all Catholics. And we would like you to recognize the independence and sovereignty of Croatia. Well, Croatia was part of Yugoslavia. And there was already fighting over a possible succession to Yugoslavia. And Kohl said, no way. And his national security advisor said, no, don't touch it with a barge pole. But then the nuncio came back, and I said, this is at the insistence of His Holiness. There must be sovereignty for Croatia. Kohl gave in because all these Croatians in Germany, a vast number of migrants, would cause an enormous amount of trouble. Plus the Bavarians and all the Catholics on the Rhine, you know, you can imagine the Pope mobilizing all these people. So he said, all right, and but then the whole of the rest of the European community, as it just still was, said, no way, you're not going to do that. The whole place will blow apart. Yugoslavia will blow apart into a civil war. Well, Kohl was a man of his word and persisted. So each country in the European community had to be bribed in some ways to accept this. The last on the line was Britain with Douglas Hurd and John Major in charge of the country. And finally they came to Britain and said, well, okay, what will you take? So Britain said, we want an opt-out in the EU on social and whatnot, you know, all these lefty trade union ideas. And so Kohl said, okay, sign off. And they all signed off. And then we got the civil war. Just everybody knew that if the Croats went independent, the Milosevic and the Serbs would go bananas, and the whole place started falling apart, and we had basically attempted genocide across the face of southeastern Europe. Now, the Bush administration tried to avoid this like the plague as it was coming in, and handed it all over to Bill Clinton. And the Bill Clinton administration came in, and if you look through Bill Clinton's presidential papers, you'll find there's nothing so much as Yugoslavia everywhere. I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of papers. They spent days and hours agonizing over Yugoslavia and did nothing for the first 2 or 3 years. But Clinton's advisors were saying, you know, you've got to have a foreign policy. Well, you couldn't get the Pentagon and the State Department and the agency and the others to agree on any policy on Yugoslavia. The very discussion of Yugoslavia created havoc in any government outside Yugoslavia that tried to discuss it. And the Europeans were reluctant to do anything because the Germans were responsible ultimately for blowing this thing up. And, you know, it was called like moi, not moi, no, it's somewhere outside us. Nothing to do with us, not in NATO, not in the European Community. And anyway, they said, well, you know, we believe that money solves everything. That was the German philosophy, and it had done for Germany for a lot of the time, a lot of American money originally. And they said, right, we're going to offer money, and in the end, we'll heal the whole thing up. And of course, they had no idea of what the mentality was in southeastern Europe. Money would solve absolutely nothing. They'd just burn it to keep warm, basically, or buy armaments. So Clinton faced a dilemma. He was under pressure to have a foreign policy because he was automatically looking forward to a second term. He hadn't got one. From Eastern Europe, the Visegrad group, Poland, Hungary, and what was then Czechoslovakia, just put pressure on Clinton's people to bring them into NATO. Well, since the West Europeans were thinking of sort of abandoning it, this wasn't a terribly good idea. They went to see the Americans, and Clinton was saying, we need NATO. Then we're in Europe. We stay in Europe. So this started to be very appealing. And the East European lobby in Washington was big and strong, with Madeleine Albright and people like her. And Brzezinski, who was no longer in power, but like Henry Kissinger was constantly trying to get near the levers, but through protégés. And so they fixed on the idea, perhaps we can expand NATO. And that gives us a reason to keep it and stay there. And this was the proposal through 1994. All this was in secret. No one in Congress had any idea. It was top secret. And in the end, they got to discussing, well, who's going to join NATO? And it was obvious the Visegrad group would join. And then we said, who else we have? So they started creating lists. And in the list, everybody was trying to compete with one another. And they added in, at the bottom, Ukraine. This is 1994. The Ukrainians had become independent of Russia. They wanted neutrality. They wanted protection for their own borders. They didn't particularly want all these nuclear weapons that were sitting there, even though they'd helped build them, because they didn't have any of the control systems, command and control. They were all in Moscow. And they agreed with the Russians, with a bit of American pressure, to give those nuclear weapons away, which they did in December 1994. But before that happened, these proposals for an expanded NATO were working their way through the State Department and the National Security Council. Now, Strobe Torbert's job was in the State Department, not the National Security Council. And the pivotal role was played in Clinton's foreign policy, not by the State Department, but by the National Security Council. And so Strobe didn't get to see all the papers until it was too late, basically. October 1994, he finally got hold of the memo, the last memo for the expansion of NATO, which had the Baltic states on it and Ukraine. In other words, they were going to expand NATO at the expense of the former republics, or to reward the former republics of the Soviet Union. So where would that leave Russia? This was such a hot potato. Strobe Talbot was so infuriated that Bill hadn't even asked him in to talk about it that he wrote a huge memorandum to the Secretary of State, more or less saying, you know, you can't do this. This will just create chaos, havoc, and possibly war in Europe. This was Strobe's last statement on the subject. The other great opponents on the expansion of NATO, well, other than the Europeans, because they hadn't been asked, were the Pentagon. Nobody in the Pentagon wanted NATO expanded because they had problems thinking about how they defend the existing NATO, let alone expand it. But they were locked out. They weren't even invited in on the discussions. And when the Secretary of Defense insisted he sit down with Bill Clinton to talk it through, Clinton agreed to meet him and then just said, we've decided. So the Pentagon was stuck. And they had no idea how they'd cope with this. So it wasn't long before all of this got out. It got out to Congress. And then a whole series of the most respected Russianists in the United States proceeded to speak out against it, George Kennan being the foremost, the creator of containment, and then a whole slew of others. And what they warned was, and you can read all these statements from 1995, 1996, 1995 is the year we really get going, saying, if you do this, it's quite possible you end up in a war with Russia. And I know you think Russia's on its face, but it won't always be on its face. That's what they warned. None of this did any good because Clinton was planning to stay in for that second term. And then once Clinton had locked in the Visegrad group as part of NATO, there was a whole line of other countries wanting to come on board. Ukraine had not been asked. And in fact, public opinion in Ukraine, very late on to 2012, 2013, most people were not interested in this. They wanted Ukraine neutral. Apart from the fact Ukraine had real problems of its own with Russia, as soon as Ukraine was independent, Russo, who was the deputy president to Boris Yeltsin, immediately said, what about Crimea? They've got Crimea. Khrushchev gave them our Crimea. Khrushchev, Ukrainian, gave the Ukrainians Crimea. We want it back. If they want to be independent, fine, but we want Crimea back. So there's a whole hullabaloo. And remember, Russia, at this stage, former Soviet Union turned reduced to Russia, was in an incredibly bad condition. The rate of inflation was thousands of percent as they started to improvise with a free market. And they had public opinion. They had a form of democracy. And in the Duma, all hell broke loose over Ukraine and other matters. So already for the Russians, settling things with Ukraine was a hot potato. And what about the Soviet fleet in the Black Sea? And there were negotiations for more than 7 years between Kyiv and Moscow about the fate of the fleet and the naval base at Sevastopol, which in the end they agreed on a long lease. The Russians would take Sevastopol on a long lease. But there was this deep-seated grievance in Russia against everybody because Russians woke up one morning, they went to bed in the Soviet Union on welfare and woke up one morning and found that millions of their 20 million, I think, Russians were suddenly living abroad. Well, some of those who woke up abroad were quite happy about it. but an awful lot of Russians weren't. Their nation, they felt, had been dismembered. So these weren't people to fool around with, but they really had no war-fighting capacity at all. And when they started to fight a war to keep down these former tribesmen in the south and the Caucasus, they made an awful bloody mess of it. So they couldn't really present a threat to the East Europeans who were joining NATO. So they couldn't understand why the East Europeans were joining NATO. To them, it made no sense. At that stage, they hadn't realized the American role. Anyway, as things go forward, things get from bad to worse. And the election of Tony Blair in Britain at the end of the 90s seemed to promise something better. By 2000, Tony Blair had decided, on advice from the head of MI6 and everybody else who knew things, that they should bring this new young man, Putin, whom Yeltsin had predicted would be president. At the beginning of 2000, he was standing in for Yeltsin, that they should bring him in, hug him close, hug your enemies close. And that was Blair's stratagem from the beginning of 2000, even before Putin had got elected as president of Russia in March, April 2000. And this went well until there was an election in the United States at the end of the year, and George Bush 43 comes into office. And he comes into office thinking, we can dominate the world. We don't have to ask anybody. The neocons had decided they would, one way or another, sort out the Middle East, make it look like America, put in all sorts of elections and things. And the first priority was get rid of Saddam Hussein. So January 2001, the National Security Council meets to work out how they're going to get rid of Saddam Hussein. No one abroad knew about it. By the time they got sort of towards the autumn, they notified the British, they both notified R.C., head of MI6, that they were going to have to get rid of Saddam Hussein. And boy, the Europeans weren't terribly happy with this idea, and Tony Blair was trying to find a way around it, etc. This was what was going on in the foreground, but in the background, Tony Blair was trying to pull Putin in, and it was working. It was working very well in 2000, 2001. And then it started to crack. And it cracked over a key issue. Blair, the Europeans, most of the moderates, there were moderates in the neoconservative administration of George Bush, wanted to pull the Russians in. So the slogan was 19, not 19+1 at meetings they had with the Russians, but 20. NATO at 20. Was Russia actually to be a member of NATO? It was not quite clear, but she was to be almost a member of NATO. And this seemed to be working very well. Even George Robertson understood it. So what then happened was Don Rumsfeld. And if there were two neocons in that administration at the top level who wouldn't suffer fools gladly, it was Cheney, who, if you didn't go hunting with him, you were probably okay. But Don Rumsfeld was the key thing. No decision could be made on any matter relating to defense, which meant the whole of foreign policy, if Don Rumsfeld didn't say yes. And at a key meeting, to follow up on NATO 19+1, which Rumsfeld made clear he opposed, root and branch, and it was sort of going ahead at NATO Council meetings, at the key meeting, Jonathan Powell came in, flew in from Britain, in the Situation Room with them all. They're sitting there with George Bush, and everybody's going, where's Dom? Dom didn't turn up. Dom abandoned the meeting, and they couldn't reach the decision. And they blocked it, single-handedly blocked it. When I asked Kellin what was the turning point for Putin, He said it was 2003 when they realized that this proposal they had was dead in the water. Kellyn had actually written the Russian proposal for these things, and it was destroyed at a blow. And Putin said very clearly to Ukrainians when he was in negotiations with them, which were constantly in negotiations, you know, if we can't be in NATO, we will block NATO. And he made this very explicit. This was made explicit again in 2008 when George Bush, before entering his retirement, crazily decided that they would force through at the Bucharest meeting of NATO in the spring of 2008 the admission of Georgia and Ukraine into NATO. And at that stage, most Ukrainian public opinion was not at all interested. They were mildly interested in the European Union, as then was. But they weren't interested in this. But, you know, where there's a will, there's a way. They had this meeting, and it was to force it on the French and the Germans and the British. Well, the British throughout this episode, unfortunately, but it's sort of the way we've been since, certainly since Suez, always said to the Americans, said to the Europeans, yes, of course, oh, we'll go with you, don't worry, we're with you. And then to the Americans, don't worry, we're with you. And in the end, the British went sort of silent and went with the Americans. But the French and the Germans made clear that they would not go with this. It might mean a potential for war with Russia. When Putin heard, he flew in. He was still attending some of these meetings because it was still it was back to 19+1, and made clear that it was a red line. If you took Ukraine out from its neutrality, it would be a red line. And the French and the Germans just said to the Americans, it's not going to work. And they made some mealy-mouthed compromise statement, and they dropped it. And the Bush administration disappears into history, and Obama comes in. But whereas Bush and his people were madly, fanatically interested in expanding America across the globe, you know, taking in the Middle East and all the rest of it, Obama, you know, barely looked at a map. He really wasn't concerned. He was concerned for the domestic agenda. And the domestic agenda required certain things which foreign policy would get in the way of. But he changed. And he changed in the same way that Condi Rice had changed when she was National Security Advisor under George Bush 43. She saw possibilities for democracy in the Middle East. And Obama began to delude himself about democracy in the Middle East. And they ended up piling into Libya to liberate the Libyans from other Libyans, which is always a bad idea. These proposals had originated with the French, who were obviously up to no good. The British went along with the French because our Prime Minister hadn't a clue. And I don't know what the Foreign Office was doing at the time. And so the idea was we would we would go in and liberate for humanitarian reasons, which ended up being bombing them from a great height. As you know, when you bomb people from a great height, it's difficult to tell one from the other. And the result was, the mess is still Libya, as it is Iraq and everywhere else the Americans chose to bomb into democracy. Well, the Russians, Putin was out of office. Putin was prime minister then. He had been president for too long, and he had to give it over to his old friend Medvedev. And Medvedev in those days was a soppy character who believed in democracy and that American high-tech was what Russia should be, America and high-tech. And Medvedev went along with the Americans who were fooling them that they weren't actually going to get rid of Gaddafi running Libya. They were just sort of going to help out at the edges, sort of humanitarian stuff, people in white jackets and helmets. And then they suddenly, in the New York Times, an editorial appeared written by the British and the French president, British prime minister, saying, you know, we're basically going to have regime change in Libya. And they went ahead. The bombers took off from East Anglia and dropped bombs on all sorts of people. And Medvedev, who had hoped to win another set of elections, he was just cut off at the legs. And Putin said to him, I told you so. I predicted this would happen. So that alternative in Russia, this sort of vaguely promised democracy, it's not Navalny promise, it was much vaguer than that, ended with that episode. And then things just got worse because they'd already got bad in Yugoslavia, where the Americans ended up mobilizing NATO to bomb the Serbs into submission and to take Kosovo from them. Anyway, this is all terribly complex, but the general drift is that things got really bad. By the time we get to 2014, and I'm going on too long probably. By the time we got to 2013, the EU had decided it was going to push for the absorption of Ukraine into EU. A lot of Ukrainians weren't terribly keen, particularly those, I mean, it was a terribly corrupt place, and particularly for the businessmen who were going to lose out, and a lot of economists, because the terms for joining the EU were like having the IMF do a visitation on you. Sooner or later you'd have queues of unemployed. They were going to make everything efficient. Every Latin American country's been through it. And they weren't so keen. But the people at the EU were being pushed in this direction from Poland, from Sikorski, who was then foreign minister. The Poles were very anxious to see Ukraine within EU and then within NATO. And Sikorski was one of those who pushed in 2008 for the American solution to the Ukrainian problem. So this was really getting bad. Obama wasn't really paying much attention to what was going on at the time. He had various people covering it for him, for CIA and others. And Putin thought, this is it, I'm going to stop this process. And he went in and read the riot act at Yanukovych, who was running Ukraine. Yanukovych was a hopeless figure. If you look at him, you think he might be on some comedy program. He was overweight, he was out of things, they were all corrupt. And so Putin came along with more dosh and basically said, look, you know, whatever you need, we'll pay you. Just don't join. Well, Ukraine had already sort of committed, and so they had to go along to the meeting in the Baltic, and where Mrs. Miracle was waiting for them. And this was, you know, going to be the great event, and he just said, "Niet." And the Europeans threw a fit, and they couldn't believe it. And some of them Germans said, well, do you need more money? And that didn't go down well. It was a stop. In the autumn of 2013. Now, some people in the United States suddenly woke up and thought, what's just happened? We thought they were joining the EU and then sooner or later NATO. And they mobilized Soros Foundation, CIA, USAID. 3 new television stations appeared from nowhere within 1 month. There was an editorial in the Washington Post from the Endowment for Democracy, which no one had really heard from for a while. It was created in 1983 by Reagan as a CIA front because they didn't want CIA meddling everywhere. Let's create another organization which in fact does what CIA does in terms of regime change. And so they had an editorial saying, you know, stop this, stop whatever is happening with the Russians in Ukraine. And then mobilization in the streets, you know, there was a sort of pattern to these operations in countries where the Americans were trying to turn public opinion round. The mobilized demonstrators were effectively just concentrated into the center of Kiev, and life went on as normal in most other places. There was disturbances in the east where Russian speakers lived because the Ukrainian regime was under pressure to unify, to create real nationhood through homogeneity. That's always a mistake, but statesmen like the idea. It's like making Scotsmen speak English. It didn't go down well for several hundred years. And crushing the Irish, that didn't go down well. Crushing the Welsh had been done so long ago, and they hung on to their language. Well, the idea the Russians in the East were going to go through this was obviously led them to turn to Putin for some sort of solutions. And what about Crimea? Crimea was still Ukrainian. So you can see the ingredients were there for a very nasty confrontation. Took place in Kiev in the beginning of 2014, and the American policy won, basically. And Yanukovych, who said he wasn't going to give way, ran off to his country house, grabbed a few suitcases and his dog. We never heard what happened to the wife, and jumped into a helicopter and headed east, and said he'd got a meeting to go to of the Regions Party. And Putin knew nothing about this. The Russians were trying to find a way. The EU, which was an incompetent bunch of people, having made the mess in the first place by pushing it too quickly, then tried to sort of seal it all up. And it was really a disaster. In the end, it was force majeure, and they had a new regime in Kiev, which wasn't really representative of most of the people. They were due to have elections later in the year. So this was Putin's defeat, which he didn't take kindly to, and that's why he snatched Crimea from under the feet of the Americans. What was Obama's reaction? Oh well, Russians do this sort of thing. No, we shouldn't react. Don't make them feel important. And this was awful. And Mrs. Merkel was terribly concerned to keep going the Nord Stream pipeline because Germany worked on natural gas, cheap natural gas from Russia, and she didn't want to have a confrontation with Putin. So they had a sort of minor theatrical confrontation. But they signed up for a second pipeline for natural gas. In other words, it's not what you say that counts, it's what you do. And Germany, all the way through to 2022, was essentially in hock to Russia because of natural gas. And Putin looked at it that way, so why listen to Mrs. Merkel? You remember the scene when Mrs. Merkel visits Moscow at the dacha, and Putin knows she was bitten by a dog. I mean, when Putin sees people, he has everything on them. She was bitten by a dog as a child. And so Putin's sitting there with her in her armchair, and this huge black dog walks in, and Putin's sort of looking just to see, softening her up. It's not in her memoirs like that, of course. Nothing's in her memoirs. So this disaster, you had Germany effectively out of the game, Poland agitating for action, and Obama sort of out of it. He thought, oh, well, never mind, something will sort itself out, and they made all sorts of sanctions against Russia which didn't hurt, which only resulted in the Russians making their own French bread. I mean, EU sanctions were basically agricultural, and it just helped push up Russian agriculture. It was a complete waste of time. But Putin hadn't finished, because the Americans in particular, but also the British, then started training up Ukrainian forces from 2014. And the Russians introduced their covert operations into the east to basically try then and expand their control from Crimea as far through Donetsk and down to Odessa in the south. In other words, anybody who wasn't a native Ukrainian speaker was somehow assumed to want to be part of Mother Russia, which was probably true in Crimea, but it wasn't necessarily true in Donetsk. This is the scene we get set for war in February 2022, because Putin, since 2003, had an idée fixe, which was to prevent Ukraine becoming part of NATO. But the NATO powers seem to be intent on drawing Ukraine in. And with this COVID Wuhan virus interlude, when Putin was alone in his dacha for far too long and with some very peculiar people, came to the idea that he was going to force it by negotiation, which he tried 2021, and it failed. But then, miracle of miracles, the new American president was senile and ran away from Afghanistan. I mean, you couldn't get a flight out, could you? And left all this equipment behind, including the Bagram Air Place, which monitored Chinese nuclear experiments and explosions. This was a monitoring place for China. And they just left everything behind so that the nice Afghans, the Taliban, could arm themselves to the teeth, lock up women, cut education, and make the place a complete hellhole, which they'd done previously. But never mind, America can carry on. So Putin thought, well, you know, this is a door ajar if there's ever such a thing, and the Germans were quiescent. And so he makes this awful decision to launch war in February 2022. This war, which of course was a special operation, of course, it was going to be 3 days max, turned out to be a bit longer. I mean, it was horrendous. I never thought they'd do it. I thought that, like most people, thought they were bluffing, but CIA, the director of CIA was the best, most experienced Russianist in Washington. And they said, no, it's going to be a war. The Ukrainians refused to believe it. Zelensky refused to believe it. But it happened. Putin was opposed by, one understands, the head of foreign intelligence, Lavrov, you know, almost everybody except his unqualified leaders of Russian defense, you know, Shoigu, the idiot Shoigu, and they had, if you look at the top of the Russian Ministry of Defense, you know, a small minority had actually had any military training. So, you know, it was a predictable disaster, which carries on. Okay, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Professor Haslam, for such a masterful exposition of how essentially relations between East and West fell out. I'm sure our audience have loads of questions, but I'll ask maybe the first 2 ones or so. What are your thoughts about the following proposition? The NATO round of expansion of 2004, the so-called Big Bang, whereby the Baltic states, Romania, and so on joined NATO, was the most that the Americans could squeeze out of temporary weakness of Russia peacefully. Had the Americans stopped with 2004 round of expansion, the world would have been a much more peaceful place at present, because an argument could be made that actually Russia acquiesced to 2004 round of expansion. But the problems, big problems, only started when it came to Ukraine and Georgia and the Black Sea region. And my second question, I'm sure you're getting this a lot in these debates, is the Boris Johnson question. There is this idea which actually has some grounding in a lot of, quite a few important testimonies, that it was actually Boris Johnson who wrecked Russo-Ukrainian peace negotiations in spring 2022, together, of course, with the Americans. It was after Boris Johnson essentially told Ukrainians, don't talk to the Russians, fight, we'll give you whatever you want, and then this sort of made Ukrainians, helped Ukrainians decide to carry forward.
Yes. Anything involving Boris Johnson stretches credulity that he could go there and huff and puff and pretend to be Churchill and be believed. His going there looks to have been on behalf of, and there's no way Britain was running an independent foreign policy after 1956. So in other words, he wasn't doing this on behalf of certainly the French and the Germans from the outset of the war wanted nothing more than to stop it as soon as possible. The Germans on conditions which no other member of the EU would have found acceptable, and probably no other member of NATO, except the Turks. What appears to have happened, certainly from the recollections of the Ukrainian Prime Minister, because we don't know Zelensky's version, is that Johnson came and delivered a message, basically. And one has to assume, since Biden was at that stage a little more alert and obdurately he saw himself as obdurately pro-Ukrainian ever since he'd been vice president and his son had made so much money out of the country, as we now know, before the pardon in 2014 with Burisma. This was effectively an American decision that, of course, Britain immediately backs, the poodle, and to the horror of the French and the Germans. Why? This initiative for peace was an initiative by Naftali Bennett, the former Prime Minister of Israel, who had made his name as a young commander massacring Palestinian terrorists. And when Naftali Bennett heard that Putin was going to attack Ukraine, 10 days beforehand, he made a visit to see Putin on the Black Sea, and they spent 7 hours in discussion and got on very well because Putin identified with somebody who had massacred terrorists. And they got on pretty well until the last half hour, when Naftali Bennett just said, well, I've been in communication with Zelensky. And before he could finish, Putin just went hysterical. His eyes get very narrow. And the conversation had to end. And it stopped, and Naftali Bennett failed. But he had pre-consulted all the leaders of NATO before the trip. He was the self-made. Why was he doing it? Putin said, what are you doing it? You're a Jew, for God's sake. And he said, yes, the world's full of Jews, and when you have a war, they always get killed. So I want to stop this one. And so Putin thought, that's logical, because Putin was always an admirer of Israel. He still is, because Israel always finished its wars off, as we know, to the last body. And he thought, this is the sort of country we should be. And Naftali Bennett didn't give up. 22nd of February, we have this ghastly invasion, incompetent, brutal, everything that's wrong with Russia when it goes wrong. And within 10 days, Naftali Bennett grabbed the most horrifically worn-out aeroplane he could find in Israel, grabbed his brilliant interpreter, and flew off to Moscow secretly and saw Putin again. He didn't say, "Oh, well, I told you, Vladimir, I warned you." But they had a good conversation. Naftali Bennett had talked to the NATO leaders before he went. He thought he had some chance. And when it came to the point of mentioning Zelensky's name, which Naftali Bennett must have dreaded, Putin just said, "Tell him I'm not going to have him assassinated." And in fact, that was the first thing Zelensky wanted to know. That's the first thing Zelensky wanted to know. So as far as the Ukrainians were concerned, although the massacres at Bucha, those villages on the way south, had been uncovered for the world to see, this, horrendous killings, butchering. The sort of butchering that had gone on in the wars in the south, when the Russian army failed to secure its objectives, they go around hacking people up, and that's what they did. Despite that, Ukrainians were willing to sort out a deal and thought that Naftali Bennett had got NATO lined up until the arrival of Boris Johnson. The terms were not quite clear. Putin claims they actually initialed the document, which is possible, as it were, a precondition to signature. But, of course, no agreement between Ukraine and Russia settling this war was feasible unless it was underwritten by the United States. Not Britain, the United States. And that wasn't clearly not going to happen. On the 2004, I agree with you, Putin had resigned himself. I mean, after all, you can reach Estonia, I think, by car very fast from St. Petersburg in under an hour, if you really hit the pedals. So as far as the Russians were concerned, whatever the Balts did, as long as they didn't try to take Kaliningrad, he could live with them being in NATO. He could live with that. He didn't like it. It was insulting. There were all these Russians living, some of them very happily, because they're going to get EU passports along the way, but some of them not happy there, but he could live with that. So you're right. I think exactly right on that, but I can't prove it in terms of documents. He was willing to swallow that. But Ukraine, if you look at the map of Soviet Union, map of Russia, Ukraine, the rest of it, it's like losing Canada, which is on the same phone line from Chicago. I mean, remember the Americans were going to blow up Cuba in 1962 if they got the chance. So, and Venezuela is problematic. So you can see that this geopolitical mania is there. But there's another element I haven't had time to go into, which I think is awfully important, which is that during this entire period, Russia shifts from a quasi-democratic system into effectively an autocracy. And journalists start dying within 3 or 4 years of Putin becoming president. Not just leaders of the opposition. I think up to 60 journalists have died, and all sorts of very important people at the top try to avoid going further up the stairs on the second floor because they will be defenestrated if they've fallen out with the leader. And Russia is a partly mafiosi state. Ever since Putin was in Petersburg, he's a pragmatist. He was a realist. He wanted to make money. He was running things for the mayor, who was totally corrupt, in contrast to what BBC told us at the time. And he he was enveloped in mafia. And one of the reasons for Litvinenko's murder in the hospital bed in London was that Litvinenko, former member of FSB, nasty piece of work in Moscow FSB, he was digging away at the Russian mafia and had managed to lock in the evidence of Putin's involvement and was due to fly out to Madrid in a couple of days' time because the Spanish were the leading, the Spanish mafia was embroiled in the Russian mafia, and he was going to go out there and reveal the details, and they got him before he could go. This is the sort of regime that fears democracy. So it's not just Ukraine. They fear the infection of democracy, and that's why Navalny and others before him are disposed of. This is not going to change, whatever you do over Ukraine. That will never change until he goes, till he dies.
Thank you very much. Okay, Q&A time. Okay, let's gather the first round. Gentlemen here.
In your sort of travel through the leaders of the West, there's one bit that you didn't cover, which was the tete-a-tete between Putin and the Orange Eagle, the soon-to-be dictator for a day. Do you think anything was discussed there that basically gave Putin the nod to go ahead and do what he wanted to do, because perhaps Trump views everything as a real estate deal?
Let's gather.
Okay.
It's kind of related. You mentioned that under Obama, there's very tepid response to the invasion of Crimea. And I would be keen to hear your thoughts when Donald Trump took over, because I think contrary to popular belief, he actually increased the military supply to Ukraine, providing lethal aid, Javelin missiles, and actually did a lot of things that people who were so obsessed with Russiagate probably would not realize that probably that did way more damage to Russia than what Obama did. So curious for your take, and then I'm wrong.
Thank you, and one more. Yes, lady.
My question is, why in this very short narrative there seems to be so little space for Ukrainian agency and the complexities within Ukraine that existed, both in terms of NATO membership, and we actually see a lot of evidence of divided opinion, which then increased to be in favor of NATO. It just seems extremely dismissive of the fact that a very large chunk of Ukrainian society always regarded itself as European, as part of Europe, and did not look east.
Well, if I begin on the latter point, no, I'm not dismissive of that. And the vast bulk of Ukrainians in central and western Ukraine clearly had more identification with the West and were willing to go along with absorption into the European Union until certainly the specialists in Kiev were upset by the detail of the proposals for the changes in Ukrainian economy that would be required. But remember that Turkey is still an associate member of the EU from 1963. So it wouldn't have been impossible for delay and working through of these things. I wouldn't dismiss that at all. But public opinion polls in Ukraine showed no interest whatsoever in NATO for a long time, until we get to 2014, when the whole picture changes, because it's perfectly obvious to any Ukrainian who isn't actually Russian rather than just Russian speaking, that they're living next door to a country that, you know, Ukraine on its own could never stand up against. So some solution had to come. So ironically, it's Putin who is responsible for making Ukrainians identify so closely with NATO rather than the West. You see, the Americans regarded Ukraine, I'm afraid some of them still do, as a disposable item, as a subordinate state. It's very dangerous to be a small country, at all vulnerable, to be dependent on the United States, because that might change with one election. And if I trip over to Trump, I agree that the Trump, the most fantastically stupid attempts to rig the destruction of Trump, which are now clearly going to backfire, by his opponents in the deep state and the Democrat Party and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer and these ghastly people who deserved to lose the last election because so many years of deception, so many years of lies, so many years of enforced inflation in America, money printing to keep the big money happy in the stock exchange, which is going to collapse in the next few months. You know, this Trump, on the other hand, is a very, I mean, if I were Zelensky, or Zelensky is incredibly nervous at the moment. He doesn't know where to turn. And in the end, they have to convince the people closest to Trump, the people Trump trusts in the leadership that's forthcoming, like Rubio and the others, and possibly the governor of Florida, who is an old Navy man who, well, not old, but former Navy man, who may be Secretary of Defense. Hopefully not the journalist who is rather too fond of skirts at the Pentagon, who's going to be otherwise distracted. But these people around Trump will hopefully, with the addition of the French and the Germans and the Poles and the British, help thrash out something that will assure Ukraine of the possibility of the vision they had in 1991 of a neutral, secure state that's no threat to anybody and is not threatened by anybody. This is such a tall order. I mean, if Trump manages to secure that, he will have secured his name in history. And remember, that's all at the moment he's really interested in. It's the last stage saloon for him. So there's hope in that. And there was another, the Trump question. I never took seriously this Putin. I put in the book, you know, Putin's not stupid enough to think that American foreign policy can change at a whim with a change of president. That's what Trump found out. He got nothing, almost nothing done in the first term because he saw the bureaucracy. We had reason to see the deep state bureaucracy as the enemy before he even negotiated with the North Koreans. But now it's different. Now it's different. So I'm hoping that those around him, and I was a bit alarmed that he's not keeping on the director of CIA, because that man is really the wisest one on Russia, who's usually got it right all the way through.
Thank you very much. More questions? Any from this side? Yes.
Thank you. So when you mentioned hubris, is it exclusively Western hubris, or Mr. Putin also has a hand in this hubris? Can we lay blame on Mr. Putin as well for unleashing this war?
Yes, yes. Until I'd researched it, it was obvious. American hubris was more obvious because it's so apparent even in the declassified documents of the end of Bush I and Clinton I regime. The hubris, unfortunately, on the Russian side is not just Putin. I quote a meeting, the last meeting Yeltsin had with Clinton. Well, Yeltsin says to Clinton, well, Bill, you know, why don't we do this? We have Europe, and you have the rest of the world. Now, he wasn't drunk at the time, but this this idea that somehow Russia could recover its entire imperial past by being an equal with the United States, that this has never gone. It was there under Stalin. Stalin always said, if you control Europe, you control the world. And his view was that if the Americans would leave him alone, this would eventually happen. And Yeltsin had this. Yeltsin's national security advisor, who seemed to some Westerners, such a civilized Western guy. I had that experience with my friends in Moscow after the end of the Soviet Union, when they said, Jonathan, I mean, you know, we've got democracy, we've got to lock them up. And I said, who? And he said, all these agitators. And I said, Sergei, that's what democracy means, is you don't lock up the agitators. Anyway, so there's a sort of civilizational problem there. So this hubris, I'm afraid, is there with Rutskoy. It's, oh God, some of them have it worse than Putin does in the leadership. I won't name them all, but and Medvedev has lapsed into it after his humiliating defeat at the hands of the Americans. So you don't have to rub much off the skin to get to that layer. And it's not surprising. I mean, how long did it take Britain to get over its empire? I remember staring out of the window when the fleet was leaving from Plymouth to save Las Malvinas, Falkland Islands. And I was thinking, oh my God, I was in the territorials. I'm going to be called up. And all of my relatives in the home counties were saying, at last. So in other words, the Falklands War was the avenging of the loss of empire. And remember France under de Gaulle, you know, and this idiot Lang as a culture minister later trying to ban American pop music, and the way the French Academy tries to ban words from English. This is this imperial obsession carried forward. Spain has managed to recover from it, but they have 500 years. So give Russia 500 years. And we might get through it, but we shouldn't see them. We should see them as special and as different, but not as inferior, because we suffer from some of those diseases as well.
Thank you. More questions? Yes.
Yeah, your telling of the EU angle of this seems to be, I'd say, slightly jaundiced, maybe we could say, which I can, you know, having been through the Brexit negotiations, I can see why one would have a jaundiced perspective about the EU. But look at it from the position of the Ukrainians, and talking about Ukrainian people. If you're a Ukrainian, you can see Poland and you can see the Baltic states, who were on a par with you in 1990, now extremely prosperous. The Estonians, the Latvians are extremely rich country, and they're in NATO, they're in the EU. You can see the pull factor of the EU. And when 13-14 happened, and a delegation of EU people went to Kiev to try to patch up a deal with Yanukovych, they had a deal with Yanukovych, and it created another riot because the EU hadn't done enough to be pro-EU. You know, they weren't as pro-EU as the people in the Maidan Square. So, you know, I'm perhaps underestimating the genuine and real pull factors towards Europe that made it perhaps inevitable that Ukrainians would want to leave the Russian orbit, however much Russia didn't want them to go, and however much mischief making there was by some Americans.
Yeah, I mean, I know Ukrainians who at the time took a different view, as economists in particular, when they did the numbers. It was like having the IMF arrive in Britain in 1978, was it? Dennis Healy brought them in to shake up the rest of the cabinet, and we were all going to be on gruel for several years. We'll go through this again, I think. Yes, I don't entirely disagree with you. My disagreement is over the ineptitude of the EU in handling it in 2013 and in 2004 with a different leadership in the Commission. Putin actually said he thought EU wouldn't be a bad idea for these neighboring countries, that Russia in fact could benefit from it. So there was more open-mindedness there before we get the snap. Sikorsky very much after 2008 thought the only way forward is not NATO, it has to be EU. So, and he's a man with an idée fixe. I mean, getting him off it is difficult. And Applebaum must know all about that. And he decided that he would push this. And you can see it in the newspaper columns in Poland from the period up to 2013. They're pushing, they're pushing, they're pushing. The Germans want them to slow down. The Germans were trying to get the Commission to slow down in 2013 because they were the ones closest to Russian sensitivities. So it's a question of timing and how you handle it. And the trouble was, those in charge of these negotiations were totally distracted in 2013 by Kelly in the United States. They were trying to do the deal on Iran, Iranian nuclear weapons deal. So the EU people wanted to be fully in on that. So they took their eye off the ball and left it to the numbers people in Brussels to carry on with the Ukrainians. So they didn't see any problem. They weren't looking over to the Russians. And the Russians were themselves distracted. The Sochi Olympics were coming up. All these other things were going on. Putin's mind wasn't put on the problem until the summer of 2013. So it was a sort of cock-up. If the Poles had been more patient, if the EU realized that actually Ukraine was the priority and not Iran, we wouldn't have had this horrendous, sudden, total crisis that emerged. And the EU people know that they were to blame for pushing it too fast without taking into account sensitivities. And Mrs. Merkel's attitude, in a sense, was, and she was the most humiliated by it in the end. She was hung out to dry for this in September 2013, But the trouble was the Germans were seen as totally soft on Russia. I mean, Sikorsky was always thinking, I thought if I ran Germany, it would be so different. He still thinks that and wants Poland to be the strong arm against Russia. So it's a sort of cock-up I don't think anybody realized. And had you run it back and told them, Brzezinski gave it's in my book, Brzezinski, just the day after everything went totally wrong in Kiev and Yanukovych fled, and then we had the takeover of the parliament and all the rest of it. Brzezinski came out with an editorial far too late saying, hang on, let's take this slowly. There are certain bits we can do without frightening the Russians too much. It's a very, very interesting editorial, and it was a day too late. And I think if they'd followed his advice, and perhaps even Merkel's initial impulses, we could have smoothed things out for a while and then worked through negotiation. I think it's a tragedy what happened, absolute tragedy on all sides what happened, and some of those involved have acknowledged that they sort of screwed up.
Thank you. Yes.
I'm sure I speak for everybody in this room when I say you've given a fantastic and insightful and quite remarkable talk. But you've talked almost entirely about the history. What I wonder, would you try to make some predictions of what's going to happen in the future? when is this war going to end? What's going to happen with these countries that you've talked about in the next 10, 20, 30 years?
Well, I can see further out than close up. Further out, if economic conditions go the way they're appearing to go, the West won't be in a great condition to dictate a peace on the East. If the market on Wall Street goes belly up and inflation, which is going up again in the United States and is not at all what the CPI says it is. You know, if you cut out energy, cut out housing, then it's only 2-something%. Okay, we don't live anywhere, we don't drive the car, we don't eat food, and inflation's fine. Well, anyway, we're in that deluded world, and I think Trump's people are also in that deluded world. And what I'm saying is the balance of economic power between East and West is going to shift because we're moving into a commodity era. So when the metals and everything else, those prices are going to go through the roof. Guess which country produces everything but chrome? The Russians. Well, the Ukrainians don't have oil, but they've got lots of other things. So the point is, it depends when these negotiations reach their height. If they reach their height in the next few months, which takes a few miracles, if the Trump people can square the circle with Putin. The real problem with Putin is not that he won't back down on territorial issues. He's going to be forced to. And you know that Lavrov is, because I read the hardline Russian press, Vzglyad, which has all these godforsaken former KGB people and military people who read it daily. And one of them wrote in the other day when he heard that Lavrov is giving an interview with Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson, I could go there. But anyway, they were worried by it. And I don't think anybody's paying attention. But anyway, and they said, I hope Lavrov isn't going to start talking about Russian-speaking people. In other words, that Lavrov, by mentioning only Russian-speaking people in Ukraine instead of Russians, is going to give away the shop. They all fear, the hardliners in Russia fear, that if Lavrov's people, and they've all stayed in post except one guy in Geneva, if they get their hands on the negotiations, they're going to start giving away all these rights in eastern Ukraine, which they have no right to. But they're going to have to negotiate them away. They might keep Crimea, but they're not going to keep the rest. There are these fears amongst the hardliners. So once negotiations start, all hell is going to break loose in Moscow from all these varied interests. The businessmen want to get back to normal. They didn't want this war. The diplomats want to get back to normal. Most of the military do because they know they're losing. So, you know, you can toss a missile on the Ukrainians, but you have to send North Koreans to clean up. It doesn't look good. So I think a negotiation which has to be some sort of, there has to be restitution. There has to be compromise on both sides. And the best people to run it is probably Naftali Bennett and not the Americans, you know, on behalf of everybody. There has to be some neutral party. The Chinese want a peace. The Turks want a peace, you know, but do you want Erdogan running it? There are all sorts of unpleasant people who are actually on the right side in respect of a peace. None of these countries wanted this Ukraine war. So there's a lot of, in India, vested interest to get this done. But there will have to be a territorial compromise. It needs to be done quickly before opposition in Moscow can mobilize. My view is when they finally do a peace, which I hope gets done under Trump, Putin may end up having to live the rest of his life in Saudi Arabia. Because who started this? I mean, who's responsible? Well, why did my son die on that front? When the truth is known within Russia about this sequence of events, none of those people at the very top in Russia is going to have a future. And unfortunately, this is an inhibitor on a negotiated compromise. Who is willing to stick their necks out? There needs to be statesmanship on both sides to get a peace. Zelensky is willing. I mean, Zelensky, in his position, is the most ghastly. He never had these expectations. In 2021, he thought he could sweet talk Putin backwards, but it was too late. He desperately wants a settlement, but all those mothers are going to say, so what did my son die for? This is the problem. That's why we didn't have a peace between 1914 and 1918 earlier.
Thank you. The very last question. Okay, gentlemen here.
You just mentioned China. I was wondering all the time, where do you think China fits into this whole story?
Well, it doesn't. In one sense, it's a beneficiary. They're getting cheap gas. Now they're going to get even cheaper gas from the Russians as they can send them lots of weapons they don't need. But Putin deceived them when he went to war and then made it look as though they were complicit, which was a stupid thing to do that any of his Orientalists would have said. And then they pull back. But later, when it looked like Russia might go under, then they come in and offer support. So, you know, they're sort of, they will dominate Russia in the peace for many years, I think. Their economy is so far ahead, and Russia is so depopulated in, you know, east of Ekaterinburg, you know, the gas lines. Russia will become the commodity base for the Chinese economy. And it's not a great future for Russia that way. So China stands to benefit. It's an unfortunate thing to say, but China benefited from this war. India benefited from this war. They managed to stand off against American pressure. They are creating BRICS, which the Russians nominally head, but BRICS is really an Asian enterprise. And the dollar will continue to be the currency of trade, but alternative venues are being created for the future with China in the front line. And when it can talk to India, if China and India fall out, this BRICS thing is no go. And Brazil originally was supporting Ukraine, then it sort of shifts. So if those three cannot agree, then China will have to go a unilateral route into the future with Russia as a subordinate. But Russia will be the subordinate.
Thank you. And the very last question, lady over there.
Hi. So your book is titled Hubris, and I guess, like, from what I could make out, it's basically that the Americans had a level of arrogance in pushing NATO expansion through. So if we engaged in a counterfactual, say in 2014, if we managed to make Ukraine agree to neutrality, provide security guarantees, do you think that the 2022 invasion would have still happened? Because people like Fiona Hill and West Dent, they say that it's not so much NATO expansion, but rather that Putin's a megalomaniac, or maybe he's an imperialist, and there's other factors and motivations at play.
Yeah. I don't think Fiona understands Russia. She's too young. I mean, I was going there from 1968 as a schoolboy, you know, going walkabout and getting to know Russia. And you just got to study it to death. And unfortunately, in America, in the academic system, once you've done your PhD, no one puts you through a Russian test anymore. And you hear Condi Rice trying to talk Russian, and you think, ugh. And so you can present yourself as a Russian specialist there, and Fiona is amongst the best, but nothing compared with the director of CIA. I mean, this guy, I think he was always CIA, but this guy was the youngest political counselor in the American embassy in the early 90s, and he predicted everything, almost everything that's happened. and he has a Fingerspitzengefühl on Russia. There are few people who do, and the trouble is, in America, you get promoted. It's Peter's principle. You always get promoted beyond your level of competence too quickly, and then you're the big specialist. And I think this was a big mistake. And the American bureaucracy has within it some of the best, or used to, when I was over there, some of the best specialists on Russia, but they don't listen to them. They don't get the call. No one rings them because they already know. You know, they don't want to ask some junior. This is unfortunately what happened through several administrations. So if you take one of them out and say, let's talk Russian, you know, culture, something else, you know, not sure about that. Let's meet later, you know. It's a different environment, whereas in Europe there's a more sort of inter-civilizational view. I mean, they're around the corner, you know, and people who know Ukraine, colleagues of mine, really know Ukraine. And in America, the hubris goes all the way down and is in the university system, and it's corrupting. And it sure as hell is in the financial system and the Federal Reserve. It's everywhere at the moment, but you notice mostly in the financial sector. And, you know, the big names are on the door. And I hope the Trump administration won't be paying too much attention, who present themselves as all-knowing about Russia. They should listen to people who say, well, I thought I understood Russia, but now I'm not so sure. Okay, you have the job. You know, that's how I would hire people.
Thank you. I'm afraid this is all we have time for tonight. Thank you so much, Professor Haslam. That was truly excellent. I think we have learned a lot. Hubris, The Origins of Russia's War Against Ukraine, available in fine bookstores everywhere. Thank you, audience, for your excellent questions. And the wine is being brought as we speak, so let's continue the discussion at our little reception at the back of the room. Let's give our speaker a big round of applause.